Imagine being dead for 4 days. Not unconscious, not in a coma, not hovering between life and death on some hospital bed. You were dead. Completely and irreversibly dead. Your body washed, anointed with spices, wrapped head to toe in strips of linen, and sealed inside a limestone cave cut into a hillside. Your sisters have wept until they couldn't weep anymore. Your neighbors have come to pay their respects. The professional mourners have been hired, because that's what you did in 1st century Judea. You hired people to wail outside the house of the dead so the whole village would know that grief lived there now. 4 days have passed. Your skin has changed color. Decomposition has already started. In the dry heat of the Judean desert, 4 days is enough for the body to become unrecognizable. Martha, your sister, will later say it plainly. "Lord, by this time there will be a bad odor." She wasn't being dramatic. She was stating a biological fact. Everyone in Bethany has accepted the truth. Lazarus is gone. And then a voice calls your name from outside the tomb, and somehow, impossibly, you stand up. You walk forward in the darkness. You step out into the blinding light of day, still wrapped in your burial cloth, and you see the faces of people who buried you 4 days ago staring back at you in absolute terror. The Bible tells us exactly how Lazarus died. It tells us exactly how he came back, but it never, not once, tells us what happened in between. What did Lazarus experience during those 4 days? Did he see anything? Did he feel anything? Was he aware that time was passing? Or was it like a dreamless sleep that lasted an eternity and an instant at the same time? But the story doesn't end there, and this is the part that gets uncomfortable. Lazarus didn't get to stay on the other side. He was pulled back, and that means he would eventually have to die again. He would have to go through the whole thing a second time. So what was it like? Living the rest of your life as the only man on earth who already knew what death felt like. To understand why this story shook the ancient world to its core, you need to understand who Lazarus actually was before any of this happened. He wasn't a prophet, a priest, a political leader, or anyone with religious authority or influence. Lazarus was, by every measure we have, an ordinary man. He lived in a small village called Bethany, about 2 miles east of Jerusalem, just over the Mount of Olives. He shared a home with his 2 sisters, Martha and Mary. Martha was the practical one, the one who cooked and organized and made sure everything ran smoothly. Mary was the contemplative one, the one who sat at Jesus' feet and listened while Martha complained that she wasn't helping in the kitchen. And Lazarus, the Bible tells us almost nothing about his personality. We don't know what he did for a living. We don't know if he was married. We don't know if he had children. What we do know is one thing, and it changes the entire story. Lazarus was one of Jesus' closest personal friends. The Gospel of John doesn't say Jesus knew Lazarus. It doesn't say he associated with him or taught him. It uses a very specific word. It says Jesus loved him. When the sisters sent their urgent message to Jesus, they didn't say Lazarus is sick. They said, "Lord, the one you love is sick." That phrasing tells us everything. This wasn't a teacher-student relationship. This wasn't a rabbi visiting a follower. This was genuine, deep, personal friendship. Jesus had a place where he felt at home, and it was at the dinner table of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. And that friendship is exactly what makes everything that happened next so deeply confusing. When Lazarus fell ill, it happened fast. We don't know the nature of the illness. Some scholars have speculated it was a sudden fever, possibly a bacterial infection that would have been untreatable in the ancient world. Whatever it was serious enough that Martha and Mary immediately sent messengers to find Jesus. The message was simple and desperate. The one you love is sick. They didn't even need to say, "Come quickly." The urgency was obvious. Jesus loved Lazarus. Of course he would come. But Jesus didn't come. When the messengers arrived and delivered the news, Jesus said something that must have confused everyone standing around him. He said, "This sickness will not end in death." And then, instead of leaving immediately for Bethany, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. 2 full days, doing nothing, going nowhere, while his closest friend was dying. The disciples must have been baffled. The messengers must have been desperate. And back in Bethany, Lazarus was getting worse. By the time those 2 days had passed, Lazarus was already dead, already wrapped, already sealed in the tomb. And then, after waiting, Jesus finally turned to his disciples and said, "Let us go back to Judea." The disciples immediately pushed back. Judea was dangerous for them. The last time they were there, people had tried to stone Jesus. Going back was a risk, but Jesus insisted. And then he said something strange. "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." The disciples took it literally. They said, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." They thought Jesus was being optimistic. Sleep is good for sick people, but Jesus wasn't speaking about sleep. He corrected them plainly. Lazarus is dead. And then he added a line that has puzzled readers for 2,000 years. "And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe." Glad. He used the word glad. His friend had just died, and he said he was glad he wasn't there to prevent it. That sounds cold until you understand what Jesus was actually doing. He wasn't glad about the death. He was glad about what the death would make possible. He was about to do something that would require the situation to be completely hopeless first. Not mostly hopeless, not technically hopeless, but completely, undeniably 4 days in the grave hopeless. Because what Jesus was about to do only works if everyone has already given up. Meanwhile, in Bethany, the mourning was in full force. In Jewish burial tradition, the body was washed carefully, anointed with oils and aromatic spices like myrrh and aloe, and then wrapped tightly in long strips of linen cloth. The face was covered with a separate cloth called a sudarium. The wrapped body was then carried to the family tomb, usually a cave carved into a limestone hillside and laid on a stone shelf inside. A large, heavy stone was rolled across the entrance to seal it. The mourning period in Jewish custom lasted 7 days. Family and friends would gather at the home of the deceased, sitting on low chairs or on the ground, receiving visitors, sharing memories. Professional mourners, often women hired specifically for the purpose, would wail and chant lamentations outside the home. It was loud, public, and communal. Death in the ancient world was not a private affair. By the time 4 days had passed, something significant had happened in the Jewish understanding of death. There was a widely held belief in first-century Judaism that the soul of the deceased lingered near the body for 3 days after death. During those 3 days, there was theoretically a possibility of return. The soul might re-enter the body. A mistake might have been made. A person who appeared dead might revive. But after 3 days, the soul departed for good. Decomposition made the body unrecognizable, and the connection between body and soul was considered permanently severed. After 3 days, there was absolutely no hope. Lazarus had been dead for 4. This is not a coincidence. This timing matters enormously. Jesus didn't arrive on day 1 when people might have said it was just a deep sleep. He didn't arrive on day 2 or 3 when some might have argued the soul hadn't fully left yet. He arrived on day 4, when every single person in Bethany, every Jewish tradition, every biological reality pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Lazarus was gone, completely, irreversibly gone. And that's when Jesus arrived. But this is where the story splits into something nobody expected, and where it has divided scholars, theologians, and ordinary believers for 20 centuries. The Bible gives us absolutely nothing about what Lazarus experienced while he was dead. No words, no hints, not a single verse describing light, darkness, peace, torment, or anything in between. Just consider the situation. You have a man who was dead for 4 days and came back to life. This is the most dramatic resurrection in the entire Bible before Jesus himself. And the author of the Gospel of John, who clearly had access to Lazarus and his family, who records the dinner party where Lazarus sat at the table with Jesus just days later, chose to include 0 testimony from Lazarus about the afterlife. That silence is enormous. Some scholars believe the silence was completely intentional. The point of the story was never about what happens after death. It was about who has authority over death. The spotlight was meant to stay on Jesus, on his power, on his identity as the Son of God. If Lazarus had started describing visions of paradise or the underworld, the focus would have shifted. The story would have become about Lazarus's experience instead of Jesus's authority. Other scholars take a different view. They believe Lazarus simply had nothing to report. Some theological traditions hold that death is a state of unconscious rest, what's sometimes called soul sleep. In this view, Lazarus experienced nothing during those 4 days, no awareness, no visions, no passage of time. He closed his eyes in death and opened them to the sound of Jesus' voice, and from his perspective, no time had passed at all. But the early church couldn't let it go. Traditions and legends about Lazarus's experience multiplied across the centuries, especially in the Eastern Christian world. Some accounts describe Lazarus as a man who was permanently changed by what he saw. One tradition says he became completely silent about the afterlife for the rest of his life. Not because he had nothing to say, but because what he witnessed was so overwhelming, so beyond human language, that he refused to describe it. He carried the weight of that knowledge alone, unable or unwilling to share it with anyone. Another tradition from the Eastern Orthodox Church says that after his resurrection, Lazarus never smiled again. A man who lived another 30 years after coming back from the dead, and in all that time, he never once smiled. Whatever he had seen on the other side had stripped away his ability to experience ordinary human happiness. The world of the living felt hollow compared to what he had glimpsed. An even darker tradition says that Lazarus wept constantly. Not tears of sadness about his own life, but tears of grief over what he had witnessed happening to human souls in the afterlife. He had seen something about the state of the dead that broke him, and the knowledge that everyone around him was heading toward that same fate filled him with an inconsolable sorrow. Now, we need to be very clear. These are traditions, they are legends, they are not scripture. The Bible says nothing about Lazarus weeping or refusing to smile or staying silent. But the fact that so many different communities across so many centuries felt the need to fill that silence tells you something important. The question of what Lazarus saw has been burning in people's minds since the day he walked out of that cave. We can't help ourselves. We need to know. And honestly, can you blame us? But let's go back to what the Bible does tell us, because the scene at the tomb is one of the most gripping moments in all of Scripture. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, Martha heard he was coming and ran out to meet him on the road before he even reached the village. And the first thing she said to him was not a greeting. It was an accusation wrapped in faith. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." That sentence contains grief, frustration, maybe even anger, but also belief. She's saying, I know you could have saved him. I know you had the power, and you didn't come. She doesn't understand why, but even in her confusion and pain, she adds something remarkable. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. She doesn't know what she's asking for. She's not requesting a resurrection. She's just expressing a faith that goes beyond her understanding. She trusts Jesus even when she can't make sense of what he's doing. Jesus tells her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha assumes he's talking about the final resurrection at the end of time, a standard Jewish theological concept. She says, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." She's being a good theology student. She knows the right doctrine. But Jesus isn't talking about the last day. He's talking about right now. He looks at her and says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." And then he asks her the most important question in the entire gospel. "Do you believe this?" Martha says yes. She doesn't fully understand what she's agreeing to, but she says yes. Then Mary arrives. She falls at Jesus' feet, weeping, and says the exact same thing her sister said. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The same words, the same pain, and this is where something remarkable happens. The Gospel of John records the shortest and maybe the most emotionally devastating verse in the entire Bible. Jesus wept 2 words, but they carry the weight of the entire scene. Jesus, who already knew what he was about to do, who had planned this moment for days, who had deliberately stayed away so that this exact situation could unfold, stood there and cried. He wept not because the situation was hopeless. He wept because the people he loved were in pain. Their grief was real, and it moved him, even though he knew it was about to end. Then Jesus walked to the tomb. He told them to remove the stone. Martha objected immediately. "Lord, by this time there will be a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." She's being practical. She's trying to protect everyone from the smell, the decay, the finality of what was behind that stone. Jesus looked at her and said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" They rolled the stone away. Jesus looked up toward heaven and prayed aloud, not for his own benefit, but so that the crowd could hear. He thanked his Father for hearing him. He said he knew the Father always heard him. And then, in a loud voice that the entire crowd could hear, he shouted a single command, "Lazarus, come out!" And the crowd held its breath, and from the darkness of the tomb a figure appeared, wrapped head to toe in linen burial strips, his face still covered with the cloth. Lazarus walked out of his own grave. The crowd erupted. People screamed, people fell to their knees, people ran, some wept, some laughed in disbelief, because what they were witnessing was not supposed to be possible. A man who had been dead for 4 days, whose body had already begun to rot, was standing in front of them, upright, breathing, alive. Jesus, in the middle of the chaos, said something so calm it's almost unsettling. "Take off the grave clothes and let him go. Unbind him, free him. He's not dead anymore. Stop treating him like he is." And this is usually where the story stops being told. The miracle happened. Lazarus came back. Amazing. End of story. But that's not where the story ends. Not even close. What happened the next morning? Lazarus woke up. He opened his eyes in his own bed, in his own house, and he had to figure out how to eat breakfast as a man who had been dead less than 24 hours ago. His sisters were there, probably hovering, probably afraid to let him out of their sight. The neighbors would have been coming by all day, staring, whispering, asking questions he couldn't answer. And what about the questions he asked himself? Did food taste the same? Did the sun feel the same on his skin? Did sleep terrify him now because it felt too much like the thing he had just come back from? We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But these are human questions, and Lazarus was human. The Bible does give us one small glimpse into Lazarus's life after resurrection. In John chapter 12, just 6 days before Passover, Jesus comes back to Bethany for a dinner. Martha is serving, because of course she is. Mary is there too, and she does something extraordinary. She takes a jar of expensive perfume, worth about a year's wages, pours it on Jesus' feet, and wipes them with her hair. The whole house fills with the fragrance. Judas Iscariot complains about the waste. Jesus tells him to leave her alone. And in the middle of all this, there's Lazarus, just sitting at the table, eating. The man who was dead is now reclining at dinner, passing dishes, listening to conversation. The gospel mentions him almost casually. Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him, as if this were normal, as if the resurrected man eating bread and fish were just another dinner guest. But it wasn't normal, and the authorities knew it. Word about Lazarus had spread across the entire region. People from Jerusalem and beyond were traveling to Bethany specifically to see him with their own eyes, and many of them, after seeing the man who had been raised from the dead, were putting their faith in Jesus. Lazarus had become, without trying, without preaching, without doing anything at all except existing, the single strongest piece of evidence that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And that made the religious establishment panic. The chief priests and Pharisees called an emergency meeting. They weren't debating whether the miracle had happened. They weren't questioning if Lazarus had really been dead. Everyone knew. Too many witnesses, too much evidence. The problem wasn't the truth. The problem was what the truth meant. If they let this continue, more people would follow Jesus. And if more people followed Jesus, eventually Rome would notice. And if Rome noticed, they would crack down. The temple, the nation, the fragile political arrangement that kept the Jewish leadership in power, all of it would be at risk, so they made a decision. And it's one of the most chilling moments in the entire gospel. They decided to kill Lazarus, again. The absurdity of that decision is hard to overstate. They wanted to murder a man that God had just raised from the dead. They wanted to use human violence to undo a divine miracle. They looked at the evidence that Jesus had power over death, and their response was, well, let's just kill the evidence. That's how dangerous a resurrected man was to the established order. Lazarus didn't have to say a word. He didn't have to preach or prophesy or perform miracles of his own. He just had to exist. His living, breathing body was an argument that couldn't be refuted, and the only way to silence that argument was to destroy it. Whether they succeeded is something the Bible doesn't tell us directly. The Gospel of John shifts its focus to the Passover, to the Last Supper, to the arrest and trial and crucifixion of Jesus himself. Lazarus simply disappears from the narrative. One moment he's at the dinner table, the most talked about man in Judea, and the next, he's gone without explanation, without farewell, without a single word. But tradition doesn't leave the story there. According to early church sources, Lazarus fled Judea after the threats against his life became too serious to ignore. Some traditions say he was placed on a boat with no oars and no sails, essentially cast out to sea by the authorities, expected to die. But instead of drowning, the boat drifted to the island of Cyprus. Other accounts say he traveled there deliberately, seeking safety far from Jerusalem and the reach of the Sanhedrin. Either way, tradition places Lazarus on Cyprus, specifically in the city of Kition, modern-day Larnaca. And there, according to these traditions, Lazarus spent the rest of his life. He reportedly became the first bishop of Kition, appointed by the apostles Paul and Barnabas when they visited the island during their missionary journeys. He led the Christian community there for approximately 30 years. 30 years. For 3 decades, Lazarus walked through the world as a man who had already died. Every sunrise, every meal, every conversation, every quiet moment alone, all of it filtered through the knowledge that he had been on the other side and been pulled back. Did he dread sleep? Did he welcome it? Did he fear his second death? Or was he at peace with it because he already knew what lay beyond? We don't know. And maybe that's the point. According to tradition, Lazarus died a second time around 63 AD, approximately 30 years after Jesus raised him from the dead. This time, there was no voice calling him out. This time, the stone stayed rolled shut. A tomb bearing his name was discovered beneath the city of Larnaca in 890 AD. The Byzantine Emperor Leo VI had a magnificent church built over the site, the Church of St. Lazarus, which still stands today. You can visit it. You can walk down into the crypt. You can stand in the space where tradition says the man who died twice was finally laid to rest for good. An inscription found on the tomb reportedly read simply, Lazarus, 4 days dead, friend of Christ. 4 days dead, friend of Christ. That's how he wanted to be remembered. Not as a bishop or a miracle or the man who saw the other side, but simply as a friend. The man who died twice was finally at rest, but his story left behind a question that 2,000 years of theology, philosophy, and human curiosity have failed to fully answer. The story of Lazarus isn't really about what happens when you die. It's about what happens when the impossible walks out of a tomb and sits down at your dinner table. It's about what you do when you're confronted with something that shouldn't be possible, but is standing right in front of you, breathing. Every person in that story had to make a choice. The crowd had to decide whether to believe their own eyes. Martha had to decide whether her faith was bigger than her grief. Mary had to decide whether to keep mourning or start hoping. The Pharisees had to decide whether to accept the evidence or destroy it. And Lazarus himself had to make the hardest choice of all. He had to choose to keep living in a world that suddenly felt smaller than what he'd glimpsed on the other side. For 2,000 years, that same choice has been sitting in front of every person who opens the Gospel of John to chapter 11. Not the choice to believe in miracles, not the choice to accept a doctrine, the choice to sit with something you can't fully understand and let it change you anyway. If this story hit different for you, you need to see what happened when Jesus himself walked out of a tomb 3 days later, because everything Lazarus experienced was just a preview of something far bigger. That video is on screen right now. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. We're just getting started.